Welcome back to the Majority Report. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is Rob Larson. He's a professor of economics at Tacoma Community College. He's the author of Bit Tyrants, The Political Economy of Silicon Valley, out from Haymarket Books. His recent excellent new piece in the Jacobin magazine is called Bill Gates' Philanthropic Giving is a Racket. Full disclosure, I'm co-hosting a new show that's launching this Saturday for Jacobin with Anna Kasparian. So I guess I have to say that. Rob, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great, Michael. My pleasure.
So actually, Rob, I do want to start with this real quick. This is a piece from November 26, 2019 in the New York Times, and it is entitled, Bill Gates Met with Jeffrey Epstein Many Times Despite His Past. I like to, past is, let's be really specific here. This isn't somebody who, I don't know, said something controversial or whatever. This is like we know what Jeffrey Epstein's past was. I mean, this is some of the most evil stuff on earth. And I'll just quote really quick. In fact, beginning in 2011, Mr. Gates met with Mr. Epstein on numerous occasions, including 3 times at Mr. Epstein's palatial Manhattan townhouse and at least once staying late into the night. Employees of Mr. Gates' foundation paid multiple visits to Mr. Epstein's mansion. And here is a quote. His lifestyle is very different and kind of intriguing, although it would not work for me, Mr. Gates emailed a colleague in 2011 after his first get-together with Mr. Epstein. I bring that up because I think we should bring that up. Everybody's like Bill Gates's or Donald Trump or the Clintons' association with Jeffrey Epstein or Wexner. But in light of the fact that Bill Gates has managed, and this is what your piece gets into, totally rebrand his public image because of this philanthropy game, and that's actually a significant way that Jeffrey Epstein laundered himself too. That famous sinister flight to Africa with Clinton and Kevin Spacey was reported contemporaneously as a kind of freewheeling, cool, charitable mission. So, big picture, how is philanthropy used to launder the evils of capitalism and its ruling classes?
Yeah, I guess the answer is pretty extensively. It's what you discover when you get into this. Yeah, Epstein's kind of special role in the recent history of the American elite is really fascinating, as you said, from the Clintons to the Trumps to, indeed, other billionaires like Bill Gates himself, all the way up to his extremely clear suicide, which no one should investigate because it's such an open shut case. Yes. It's amazing what you can do, though. You're right, to whitewash your reputation with some fairly large donation checks. That can
Steve Bannon. I just also want to. Steve Bannon, I think, also met with him.
Indeed.
Yeah. Sorry. I just always want to get as many people on the list as possible. Sorry. Go ahead.
Always time to connect more people to Epstein. That's
right.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing now. People may not realize this, but back in the 90s, like Bill Gates didn't have this sweet grandfatherly benefactor image. Like he had a reputation, and deserve it, based on his court testimony and the way it was exposed afterwards on the record. A real image as being a snotty, bullying, tyrannical monopolist, which is extremely accurate, I should say. It's not based on anything made up. Back in the 90s, of course, is when his company, Microsoft, had its very dramatic and drawn-out antitrust trial, basically for monopolistic behavior, using its Windows operating system to take over other industries like web browsing and crushing the first web browser, Netscape. That put him in real legal trouble, like a major monopoly earning tens of billions of dollars. And I encourage people to go onto the YouTube and watch just the little highlight reels of Bill Gates' deposition from that 1990s trial. He is a smug, condescending bastard in that stuff. It's pretty ugly to behold. So at that time, he had that ugly reputation. As I point out in that piece for Jacobin, that is the period when he was looking like crap on TV every night because of that trial. That's the period when he made those big $10 billion donations to his foundation. And it really really did succeed in steering the narrative away from his documented bullying, slamming his hand into his fist into his hand, saying we've got to crush our competitors, which I talk about in the book. Was able to take all that off the front pages, and to this day, people now mainly associate him with this generous global benefaction he's associated with. So it can definitely go a long way. Yeah.
So let's spend a little bit more time in the 1990s, though. What did Bill Gates actually have to do? Because remember, this is the 1990s. We're deregulating everything. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich are partnering up to get rid of almost every imaginable regulation on Wall Street, which is going to lead to help set up the context for the crashes. There's the Silicon Valley bubble, the first tech bubble, which people forget, and it's obviously it's not as significant as what we're dealing with now or in 2008, but 2000 that was actually a pretty big bubble that burst. Joseph Stiglitz even wrote the Roaring '90s. So my point is that in order to earn the attention of this is not the FDR Justice Department, this is not Johnson, this is not even maybe Nixon, frankly. This is a time where everything is getting deregulated. Clinton and Gore are bathing in corporate money of every type. And then, of course, on the other side, you have the Republicans literally just trying to wholesale privatize government under Gingrich. So how bad did Bill Gates need to be? And not just, whatever, sure, be a competitive guy, fine, whatever. But specifically, how monopolistic do you have to be to get the serious attention of the Clinton Justice Department in the late 1990s?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive question, because the answer is a lot. Like, yes, you're right. It's not like the New Deal era of antitrust enforcement when the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice, they share antitrust authority. They would spend years going after firms in court. And of course, here in the US, it's not like the European Union where the competition laws decide we're going to fine you and you're paying the fine. Here in the US, the government takes you to court and your corporation fights in court with its giant budget, but even in that sort of framework, it's amazing what Gates and Microsoft are relatively well documented with doing. So, I mean, a number of corporate and Silicon Valley practices that the big platform companies now use all the time were pioneered by Microsoft in those days. And some of it is just based on the economics of this industry. Like I say in the book, Bit Tyrants, you look at these guys, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, they mostly have monopolies in their big platform areas because of network effects. When people want to share files or share video or make computer programs to run on our computers, you need a uniform platform, you need standardization. And so that tends to attract users to one dominant platform. It tends to make these markets more likely than usual to get monopolized. But the Justice Department economist staff recognizes that. They never go after firms for having a network-based monopoly. It's monopolization, they call it in antitrust law today, using your monopoly. For example, Bill Gates, Microsoft's Windows monopoly on computer operating systems, and then using that to take over some other market or some other company and monopolize that industry. And so Gates and Microsoft have this long history of this, again, literally slamming his fist into his hand, according to all of the biographies and corporate histories of Microsoft that you read. And people do, like that idea that, these guys are the big competitors. They compete with one another to provide a good or service on the best terms. What people don't realize is these guys, they want to clear the field of competition. And once they beat one of their competitors, they take their market share, and now the firm is just that much bigger. So Microsoft, beyond those basic strategies, had all these really sleazy maneuvers. One they became famous for was when some company would arise in a marketplace related to computing, and Microsoft would realize that this firm could have a lot of success with their product. They could become a competitor in the space. So what they would do is they send one of their representatives to approach this small company. Maybe it's developing network software or basic applications for you to use, whatever. And they'd say, Microsoft, we're considering a similar product. We're interested in your project. Maybe we could partner, and we're gigantic, so that's a big deal for you. You should let our engineers look at your software code. And of course, as soon as their corporate engineers have looked at it, they then contact the firm again and say, we're no longer interested in working with you. We're about to roll out our very, very similar program of our own that's legally distinct, however. And now this stuff is kind of common in Silicon Valley, but that was a Microsoft innovation at that time. So plenty of big monopoly tactics were required to get the attention.
So then let's start talking about what Bill Gates actually did charitably. Is it true that his first, I mean, we'll get to the stuff that is much more uncritically accepted, which I'm actually very disturbed by. I'm sorry. I think it's quite disturbing that Bill Gates has an interest in population growth in Africa. I don't take that, that's just not just like, oh, that's very altruistic. I think that is something that should raise alarm bells if you know anything about anything. Or even just that, and again, you don't need to go in some big conspiratorial direction. You just need to do a little bit of reading on the origins of the climate crisis or poverty in Africa as an example. But I'm sorry to get on that digression. What about his role in schools in the beginning?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. Billionaires and the very, very wealthiest ever since the U.S. Gilded Age in the 1800s, billionaires always want to do different things with their money, and sometimes they're more public charity inclined, like Carnegie or Gates today. But they always have this interest in education very enduringly, like shaping what young people learn. And would you believe it tends to be a picture of the world that accepts the existence of a super wealthy ruling class that decides what happens. What's true, of course, Gates has that long history here, and his foundation's work in the developing world is its own issue. But here in the US, it's fascinating. I mean, the big focus, of course, is charter schools and independent schools. And what's interesting about these, I mean, there's a huge amount of variety. States and localities have a lot of different laws, and a lot of different projects have gone through. What we tend to see is these are institutions that get public money. They do get the public funds from our tax assessments, but then the state and the public have very little role over the curriculum and what is taught in those schools. So we get public money, and then Bill Gates and figures that he hires set what the curriculum is and decide what we're going to learn. It's pretty icky. Yeah, it's not something that people are, the educators, I can tell you, are very excited about. There's a lot of exciting work where people are trying to organize the teachers in these schools who may or may not be part of the AFT or the other teaching unions. But that's a big focus of Gates' domestic charitable spending program there. And it's not very attractive in terms of what it does to the schools.
I'm also, I think that as of several years ago, that even inside the Gates Foundation itself, there was some acknowledgement that this relentless obsession on testing and charters and, teacher performance, quote unquote, was actually, not successful.
Doubtless. And anyone who's worked in education can understand that. I mean, I don't teach K through 12. I teach college. I'm privileged. So I don't have to do those people are on the front lines. But anyone, many of my friends are in that primary education sphere, and they'll tell you that like the worst thing you can do is give kids more regimented, obviously testing oriented, but just very drill and memorization and rote recollection based education. Like, is this how you learn stuff? I mean, I took many standardized tests in the public school system growing up in the 80s and 90s, and I've forgotten large tracts of what I learned at that time because you're learning it for a test. You take the test, you forget it. You remember things from school if they're actually taught in an interesting way, if you learn things that appeal to what you're actually interested in. I like to believe that there are some things you can do to really remember these things and for education to endure and for people to remember ideas. But having them memorize something and then spit it out on a test like a machine, it's a version of education that appeals to data-oriented technocrats like Bill Gates and figures around him, because it gives you data and you can point to that and use that to justify taking control of the process away from the teachers, making them teach to test more. So it's something that definitely fits into their picture of education. I've yet to meet an educator who doesn't despise it.
Right. You also talk about how this fits. So there's obviously PR benefits to doing this. This would be the simplest advice that any crisis communications person could tell you. And again, let's be really clear here on numbers. Just the other day, Bill Gates, I think, is putting $50 million towards something towards corona research. I think he's worth $40 billion personally. So, this is, in a way, the analog is, I mean, look, I don't have any, I don't, I think if you have the ability and you want to, it's not a, bad thing to give a couple of bucks to somebody who asks it on the street. I also don't think if you, I don't think if you just, did a negligent homicide with your car, if you throw somebody 20 bucks, that this is sort of that analogy, right? In terms of the overall damaging effects of the economy. So, but it's also a long-standing libertarian argument. When libertarians all of a sudden feel a need to say, no, 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 we care about things too. We have a sense of altruism too. And the best thing is to take these wealthy people that we already kind of treat in this very weird, cultish superhero way, very childlike way.
Indeed.
And their money, Bill Gates adjudicating where his money goes is better than just taxing them so everybody has health care, which seems obviously a lot more simple and efficient. But somehow that's not right because they have these special brains or whatever. So can you fit in how that fits in with this broader market cult worship of these figures and how it undermines building a serious 21st century social safety net?
Yeah, right on. Absolutely. So, I mean, maybe the first thing to say about this is like, yeah, when I say, or as you repeated there, like taking these foundations and they're giving as a PR exercise, that can sound very cynical to people. Like, oh, it's all just for the cameras, whatever. Like that can sound just sort of, angry and recalcitrant. But the fact is, like, there is a record here, and the timing of Gates' major donations to his foundation right when he's looking like crap during the antitrust trial is at least suggestive. But of course, no one's saying that charity isn't worth doing or that it's bad when some billionaire decides to launder his image by giving $10 million to some entity fighting malaria in the developing world. Charity is important, and we all personally should practice it for our much smaller parts, But that's sort of the big thing. If you look at the dollars we're talking about, they're gigantic amounts to you and me. But compared to the scale of the need, they really are pretty modest. And indeed, in that Jacobin article, I was able to cite the woman who at that time was one of the heads of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And she said, our giving is a drop in the bucket compared to the government's role. Very reasonable, like during that Ebola epidemic a couple years ago, ended up costing many $10 million to fight on a much smaller scale, obviously, than the COVID-19 we're coping with now. But at that time, the Gates Foundation gave an amount that was just set, about 10% of that total cost. It's not that the amounts are negligible. It's just compared to what we're suggesting that charity can handle, it's very small. As you said, you're right, libertarians will suggest, well, we'll have private charity to support the poor and people going through epidemics or natural disasters. And what they'll say is that way it's very, it's voluntary. Like the Ayn Rand Institute, I remember a couple of years ago during after the Indian Ocean tsunami, which killed so many people in the Indian Ocean basin, they put a big post up on their website saying the U.S. should not support tsunami victims because that's not the government's money to give. How dare you tax millionaires and give some of their money to the most penniless people in the world after a disaster none of us can even picture? They say it's involuntary. Let Bill Gates voluntarily do it. And what they're assuming is exactly what you referred to, that the amounts that these guys will give are anywhere near the actual scale of what's required. And that tiny gesture he just made for COVID-19 that you referred to is a classic example. I mean, this thing will cost many tens of billions of dollars in the active campaign to fight it, let alone all the economic losses that we're still having come into view very scarily right now. So it's pretty modest numbers relative to the need. But the bigger issue she sort of also referred to is this puts so much more power in the hands of these wealthy figures and the foundations that they endow. We're talking about figures who've been CEOs of some of the biggest corporations in the world. Microsoft's $1 trillion company, or it was until the most recent market dive. It'll come back when the economy comes back one day. The amounts of money are tremendous. These companies are so big. These guys are very used to wielding a lot of power and bullying their subordinates. What we're seeing now is in this age of austerity, we're cutting taxes on these guys and cutting back on services to try to bring the budget in line. And now we say, all right, well, let these private actors fill in for the government's role. It puts this whole new tremendous lever of influence just right in their hands. So it's more than just, yeah, these guys are trying to make themselves look better and that they don't give nearly enough to deal with the problems in the face of the need. It's also, this gives them yet more authority on over our society, as if they don't have enough as it is.
Yeah, can you talk about that idea of authority and even the title of your book, Bit Tyrants? Like, how long and how hard is it going to be to disaggregate the idea of authoritarianism or tyrants or whatever from government, and realizing that it can manifest itself essentially across any large bureaucracy? Government's capable of doing it, and not only are corporations capable of doing it, they're predicated on doing it. I mean, corporations are fundamentally undemocratic inside, let alone their broader effects on society if they're not ultra regulated or democratically controlled.
I think it's going to be very difficult because it's so ingrained. So it's true when you talk to people politically about authoritarianism, more or less inevitably, they're going to talk about state authoritarianism, and not without reason. I mean, we are, of course, before this crisis, we were living in a time of renaissance of authoritarianism. Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi, my God, terrible, terrible crypto fascist figures. So that's a very reasonable association for people to make. But it is true that people don't typically associate that with the marketplace. And just the reality is, once you're looking at trillion-dollar firms that employ tens of thousands of people, or many more than that, like, those are straight, as you said, authoritarian environments. You don't decide what you do at your job, your boss decides. And perhaps you're a tech coder in the white collar workforce, and you have a little bit more autonomy within the goals set for you by your boss. That's nice. Or maybe you're, an Amazon warehouse coolie whose every second is directed by a device that you carry to track you more comprehensively. Like, the authoritarianism of the modern workplace is stunning, and it's of course only moving to new heights with this new technology. Talk about this, of course, elsewhere in the book. The ability of firms to track you outside your workplace and obviously in the work environment. There are real strides happening there. They're looking at implementing software that works through your computer camera.
Yep.
Will track your eye movements. So you can see exactly when you're looking at email, exactly when you're looking at a spreadsheet. The invasive potential of this stuff is tremendous. Now, when the government does that, there'll at least be some pushback from libertarians, from public, watchdogs. But when corporations do it, we go, it's private property. They can do that. If you don't like it, move to the other monopolist employer in your town.
Right.
So it's pretty ugly. But I mean, to answer your question, I think it's tough. Like, after all, libertarian is the term for people who support the private sector and oppose the government. We use the word libertarian to describe people with some of the most authoritarian political opinions in the world. These people think Jeff Bezos should be free to fire you if you get pregnant. Right. Well, that's not really a libertarian position. But as I wrote in my last book, Capitalism versus Freedom, for Zero Books, who it's that the presence of that authority in the workforce is tremendous. The ability of libertarians to act like it's not there, that I can't explain. I'm amazed by that.
Right.